Ancient dust and dried vanilla vanished, violently replaced by a sharp, metallic tang of blood and sweat. 1 second, Amelie reached for a crumbling tome inside Oakhaven Abbey's quiet library. Mere moments later, reality's very fabric tore open with deafening thunder. Plummeting through a vortex of biting cold and blinding violet light, endless void swallowed her terrified scream. When she finally slammed onto solid ground, she missed familiar wooden floorboards entirely. Instead, her fragile frame crashed hard against an armor-clad, muscle-corded lap belonging to history's most terrifying Alpha King, interrupting an active, highly classified war council. The great library of Oakhaven was a sanctuary of silence, a sprawling labyrinth of stone archways and towering oak bookshelves that smelled perpetually of beeswax, decaying parchment, and quiet secrets. For Amelie, it was the only safe harbor in a world completely entirely consumed by violence. Outside the heavy iron-wrought doors of the abbey, the northern territories were tearing themselves apart. The Lycan Wars had raged for 5 long, brutal years. King Dryston of the Iron Mane Pack, the ruthless sovereign of the North, was locked in a bloody stalemate against the rebel forces of Lord Gideon, a rogue alpha who commanded an army of mercenaries and exiled shifters. But in the library, the war was merely ink on paper, recorded in the daily missives that Master Barnaby, the head archivist, carefully filed away. Amelie was an anomaly in Oakhaven. At 22, she was an Omega. In the shifting world, Omegas were rare, revered, and fiercely protected, often to the point of imprisonment. They were the heart of a pack, the calming anchor to the aggressive, territorial alphas. Had her true nature been known, she would have been claimed, bred, and locked away in a gilded cage by some high-ranking lord. Instead, Amelie lived in the shadows. She wore heavy, shapeless woolen robes that swallowed her delicate frame. Every morning, she ingested a dangerous, carefully measured tincture of diluted wolfsbane and dried lavender. It made her violently nauseous, but it effectively masked the intoxicating, sweet scent of wild honey and rain that marked her as an Omega. To the monks and scribes of Oakhaven, she was just Amelie, a quiet, diligent, and entirely unremarkable human scribe. It was late autumn, and the chill had already seeped into the stone floors of the restricted wing. Master Barnaby had tasked her with cataloguing a newly acquired shipment of texts salvaged from the ruined monastery of St. Jude, a casualty of Lord Gideon's recent march. "Handle them with care, Amelie," Master Barnaby had wheezed that morning, adjusting his spectacles. St. Jude held texts predating the First Unification, magic that hasn't been breathed upon in centuries. Amelie had nodded, her fingers wrapped tightly around her lantern. Now, deep in the bowels of the restricted section, she worked meticulously. The dust was thick, dancing in the amber light of her candle. She brushed the dirt off a leather-bound ledger, her fingers freezing against the cold hide. She reached for the next book in the crate. It was different from the others. The moment her skin made contact with the cover, a jolt of static electricity snapped up her arm. Amelie gasped, dropping the book. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, kicking up a cloud of ancient dust. It was a grimoire, bound in what looked like blackened iron and dark, iridescent scales. There was no title, only a deeply embossed crest, a crescent moon pierced by a jagged sword. As she stared at it, the iron bindings seemed to hum, emitting a faint, rhythmic vibration that resonated in her teeth. "Leave it," her inner wolf whimpered. Her wolf was a small, timid creature, completely suppressed by years of wolfsbane, but its instincts were sharp. Danger! But the archivist in Amelie couldn't resist. She knelt, her coarse woolen robes pooling around her on the dusty floor. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and flipped the heavy iron latch. It gave way with a sharp click that echoed unnaturally loud in the cavernous room. She opened the cover. The pages were made of thick vellum, inscribed with a jagged looping script that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. It wasn't lycanthrope runes, nor was it the common tongue. It looked like older magic. Blood magic. Amelie leaned closer, her nose almost touching the pages. She didn't realize that the ambient magic in the room was reacting to her. The wolfsbane in her system was meant to hide her scent, but it couldn't hide her aura from a magical artifact. The grimoire sensed the dormant, pure energy of an unbound Omega. A single drop of sweat, brought on by the sudden, suffocating heat radiating from the book, rolled down Amelie's forehead and landed squarely on the center of the page. The reaction was instantaneous. The black ink flared with a blinding, violent violet light. Amelie shrieked and scrambled backward, but the shadows in the room suddenly lengthened, wrapping around her ankles like physical vines. The air pressure dropped so rapidly her ears popped. The smell of beeswax and parchment vanished, replaced by the sharp scent of ozone and burning copper. "Master Barnaby!" she screamed, clawing at the stone floor as the very air above the book tore open. It looked as though a giant, invisible sword had slashed a rift in the fabric of the world. Through the tear she saw nothing but swirling darkness and violent flashes of crimson. The pull was gravitational, an immense vacuum dragging her forward. Her fingernails broke against the stone floor. She desperately grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table, but the wood splintered under her grip. With a final, deafening crack of displaced air, the portal swallowed her whole. The restricted wing of the Oakhaven Library fell dead silent. The only evidence of her existence, a lingering scent of burned ozone, and a heavily embossed grimoire, now missing from the floor. 400 miles north, in the brutal, snow-swept fortress of Ironhold, the atmosphere in the royal war room was thick enough to choke on. King Drystan paced the length of the massive circular oak table. He was a terrifying figure of a man, standing well over 6.5 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the hearth fire. His dark hair was tied back, exposing a jawline covered in dark stubble and a jagged silver scar that ran from his left temple down to his collarbone, a gift from a fey blade years ago. He wore hardened leather armor, still dusted with snow and smelling faintly of dried blood. He hadn't slept in 3 days. "They flanked us at the Blackwood River," General Harold snarled, slamming a heavy, armored fist onto the parchment map spread across the table. Harold was an older alpha, graying but built like a mountain, his face purple with rage. Gideon's forces somehow knew our patrols would be spread thin. "We lost 200 Lycans, Drystan. 200. "Watch your tone, Harold," Beta Silas warned softly from the shadows. Silas was leaner, quicker, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a lethal proficiency with throwing knives. "You address your king." Drystan stopped pacing and placed both hands flat on the map, leaning over it. His golden eyes, the mark of his royal alpha lineage, glowed faintly in the dim torchlight. The room smelled of stale wine, sweat, and the sour tang of alpha aggression. "Gideon is moving faster than an army of his size should be capable of," Drystan growled, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the chests of the men around him. "He's bypassing the mountain passes entirely." "How?" "Magic," muttered Lord Arthur, the master of whispers, sitting near the fire. "Rumors say he has aligned with a coven of exiled blood witches. They are opening shadow paths, routes that bypass physical terrain." "Fairy tales," Harold spat. "There hasn't been a blood witch powerful enough to open a shadow path since the unification." "Then explain the massacre at Blackwood," Drystan roared, his alpha aura flaring so violently that the heavy iron chandeliers above them rattled. Both Harold and Arthur instinctively bared their necks, a biologically ingrained submission to the king's dominance. Drystan pinched the bridge of his nose, reining in his wolf. The beast inside him was feral with frustration, clawing at the confines of his mind, demanding blood and violence to settle the score. "We need to fortify the eastern ridge," Dristan said, his voice dropping back to a dangerous calm. He moved to the head of the table, heavily lowering himself into the massive, fur-lined wooden chair that served as his throne in the war room. He leaned back, spreading his long legs, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "If Gideon breaks through the ridge, he has a straight march to Ironhold. We need to know his exact route." He didn't get to finish the sentence. Above the center of the war table, the air suddenly shrieked. It was a high-pitched, tearing sound, like metal grinding against metal. "Swords!" Silas barked, drawing his twin blades in a fraction of a second. General Harold kicked his chair back, his broadsword clearing its scabbard with a sharp hiss. Dristan remained in his chair, his muscles tensing, his golden eyes locking onto the space above the table. A jagged rift of violet light ripped the air wide open. The wards of the fortress, ancient runes carved into the very foundation of Ironhold, screamed in protest, sending sparks raining down from the ceiling. Before any of the battle-hardened alphas could move to strike the anomaly, a figure tumbled out of the violet void. She didn't land gracefully. Amelie fell screaming, plummeting from the spatial tear, crashing into the heavy iron chandelier, breaking a chain, and plummeting directly toward the head of the table. She hit King Dristan with the force of a falling boulder. Dristan grunted as the breath was knocked from his lungs. Instinctively, his massive arms clamped around the projectile, his alpha reflexes saving her from snapping her neck against the armrest of his chair. They crashed backward, the heavy wooden chair tipping precariously before Dristan's sheer weight grounded it. The portal above them snapped shut with a concussive boom that extinguished half the torches in the room. For a single, suspended second, there was absolute chaos. Swords were leveled. Men were shouting. But Dristan didn't hear any of it. His arms were wrapped around a tangle of coarse woolen robes. The person in his lap was tiny, fragile, trembling violently. But it was the scent that hit him first. The impact had knocked the wind out of Amelie, and the sheer terror of the portal had caused her carefully maintained heart rate to skyrocket. Her body was burning through the wolfsbane in her system at an unprecedented rate. As the herbs failed, her true scent bloomed in the stale, blood-scented war room, like a field of wildflowers in the dead of winter. Wild honey, petrichor, and the sweet, undeniably intoxicating pheromones of an unbound omega. The scent hit the room like a physical shockwave. General Harold froze, his broad sword wavering. Silas's eyes went wide. The aggressive, warlike atmosphere evaporated, replaced instantly by a primal, heavy silence. Dristan stared down. The hood of the heavy robe had fallen back, revealing a pale, heart-shaped face, wide, terrified hazel eyes, and a mess of dark, messy curls. She was gasping for air, her delicate hands braced desperately against his armored chest. Dristan's wolf, the feral, bloodthirsty beast that had been demanding war and slaughter just seconds ago, suddenly slammed into the forefront of his mind, completely taking over. The beast didn't care about Lord Gideon. It didn't care about the war. It looked at the tiny, trembling creature in its lap, inhaled the scent of honey and rain, and purred. "Mine," the wolf rumbled in his mind. "Mate, get off the king. Now." General Harold's voice broke the spell. The massive alpha lunged forward, his broad sword raised, seeing only an unknown intruder who had bypassed their impenetrable magical wards and landed a strike on their sovereign. He reached out with a heavy, gauntleted hand to rip Amelie from Dristan's lap. A roar shattered the room, a sound so deep, so purely primal, that the very stone walls of the fortress seemed to tremble. It wasn't a man's shout. It was the roar of an apex predator. Harold was thrown backward, not by a physical blow, but by the sheer, crushing weight of Dristan's alpha aura. The air turned incredibly heavy, thick with dominant, possessive energy. Harold hit the floor, his sword clattering away, his chest heaving as he was forced into submission. Silas and Arthur dropped to one knee, their heads bowed, unable to look the king in the eye. Amelie was paralyzed. She had read about the aura of a true alpha, how it could bend lower wolves to their will, but experiencing it was terrifying. It felt like gravity had tripled. She was pinned to Drystan's lap, her face inches from his. His golden eyes were blazing, completely devoid of human pupil, entirely wolf. His chest heaved against her hands. He glared at Harold, his lips pulled back in a lethal snarl, exposing elongated canines. "Touch her," Drystan growled, his voice distorted, echoing with the beast inside. "And I will tear your throat out with my teeth." "My king," Silas managed to choke out from the floor, his eyes respectfully averted. She bypassed the wards. She could be an assassin." "Assassins do not smell of honey and fear, Silas," Drystan snapped. He finally looked down at Amelie. The blazing gold in his eyes softened just a fraction, the wolf retreating enough to let the man speak. Amelie was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She was surrounded by massive, scarred men smelling of war, sitting on the lap of the most dangerous man on the continent. Her wolfsbane disguise was ruined. She was utterly exposed. "Who are you?" Drystan asked. His voice was quieter now, a low rumble meant to soothe, though it still vibrated with intense power. His large hands, rough and calloused, were splayed across her back and waist, holding her firmly but gently, as if she were made of glass. "Oh, Amelie," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't look away from his eyes. There was a magnetic pull between them, a string of pure energy tethering her chest to his. The mate bond. She knew what it was, but she had never dared to dream she would experience it, let alone with the King of the North. Amelie of Oakhaven. Oakhaven? Lord Arthur spoke up from the floor, slowly rising as Drystan reeled his crushing aura back in. "The Abbey. That is 400 miles south of here." I was in the library," Amelie breathed, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the map, the swords, the blood. "I was cataloguing the St. Jude texts. There was a book. I touched it and—" She stopped, realizing her hands were still flat against the king's chest. She felt the heavy thud of his heartbeat beneath the leather armor. Blushing furiously, she tried to scramble off his lap. Drystan's arms tightened instantly, a reflexive, possessive grip that kept her firmly in place. "You're safe," he murmured, his eyes tracking the blush on her cheeks. "Do not run." "My king," Harold said, standing up and brushing the dirt from his armor, though he kept his distance. "Omega or not, mate or not, we are in the middle of a war. How did a book transport her through the strongest wards in the kingdom?" Drystan finally looked away from Amelie, though he didn't release her. "Where is this book, little scribe?" Amelie looked down. When she had fallen, her arms had instinctively wrapped around whatever was closest. Tucked tightly against her stomach, beneath the folds of her oversized robe, was the heavy, iron-bound grimoire. She carefully pulled it out. The dark, iridescent scales on the cover were no longer cold. They were warm, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heartbeat that mirrored her own. Silas stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at the crest on the cover. The crescent moon pierced by a sword, all the color drained from the beta's face. "Goddess preserve us," Silas whispered. "Drystan, do you know what that is?" "Explain," Drystan commanded. "It's the Codex of Athelgard," Silas said, stepping closer, though he hesitated to reach for it. "It's a myth. A legend. It was supposedly destroyed during the First Unification. It is the master atlas of the Shadow Paths." The room went deathly silent. Even General Harold looked stunned. "The Shadow Paths," Drystan repeated, his eyes snapping to the book. "The exact magic Gideon is using to bypass our defenses." "Yes," Silas said. "If we have the Codex, we can see every hidden route in the territories. We can anticipate his movements. We can trap him." Silas reached out to take the book from Amelie. The moment Silas's fingers brushed the iron binding, a violent arc of blue lightning snapped from the book, throwing the beta backward. Silas cursed, shaking his scorched hand. Amelie gasped, clutching the book closer. "I'm sorry, I didn't do that." Dryston frowned. He reached out and gently laid his hand over Amelie's. The book didn't shock him. It merely hummed. "It's bound," Lord Arthur murmured, his eyes wide with realization. Blood magic. When she touched it in the library, her aura unlocked it. It pulled her through space to the strongest convergence of Lycan magic in the realm. Your war room, my king. But the book is tethered to her now. Only she can touch it. Only she can open it. Dryston looked down at the tiny Omega in his lap. Minutes ago, she was a scribe, hiding in the dust of an abbey. Now, she was the mate of the Alpha King, and the sole key to winning a war that was tearing the continent apart. Amelie stared back at him, terrified of the shifting expressions on his harsh face. She expected him to demand her compliance, to lock her away in a dungeon until she gave them the maps. Instead, Dryston gently brushed a stray curl from her face. His thumb lingered on her cheek, his skin rough but surprisingly warm. "Silas," Dryston ordered, never breaking eye contact with Amelie. "Send word to Oakhaven. Tell them their scribe is under the protection of the Ironmane pack. Harold, double the guards on the royal wing." "My king!" Harold protested. "She needs to be interrogated. We need those maps immediately. Gideon marches as we speak." "She is my mate, Harold," Dryston growled, a lethal edge returning to his voice. "She is terrified, exhausted, and she smells of burnt magic. She will be given a bath, food, and rest in my private chambers. The war will wait until tomorrow." Dryston stood up effortlessly, lifting Amelie into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. She gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his thick neck to steady herself, the grimoire pressed between them. "Come, Amelie," the king murmured, carrying her toward the heavy oak doors of the war room. "Let us get you out of this dust." As he carried her out of the room, past the stunned faces of his war council, Amelie realized her quiet life was over. She hadn't just fallen into a war room, she had fallen into the center of a brutal political chessboard. And the king holding her was a man who would clearly burn the world to ash before he let anyone take her from him. The royal chambers of Ironhold were a stark contrast to the brutalist stone architecture of the fortress corridors. As King Dryston carried Amelie over the threshold, kicking the heavy oak door shut behind them, the biting draught of the northern winter vanished. The room was heated by a massive hearth where logs the size of tree trunks burned steadily, casting a warm, dancing amber glow across sprawling furs and velvet tapestries. Dryston set her down on a massive four-poster bed, draped in thick, dark crimson linens. He did it with a jarring gentleness, as if he expected her to shatter. Amelie immediately pulled her knees to her chest, her knuckles turning white as she clutched the Codex of Ethelgard to her stomach. The wolfsbane was almost completely flushed from her system now, and without it, her senses were overwhelmed. The room smelled intensely of Dryston, pine needles, wood smoke, and the rich, dark musk of a dominant alpha. It was intoxicating, making her inner wolf whimper and bare its neck in absolute submission, a feeling Amelie fought down with a surge of panic. "I will not hurt you," Dryston said. His voice was a low, soothing rumble, though the tight clench of his jaw betrayed the immense restraint he was exercising. He took a deliberate step back, giving her space. "You are safe here, Amelie. No one in my pack will lay a finger on you. Not Harold, not Silas, not the gods themselves." I shouldn't be here," Amelie whispered, her voice trembling. "I am just a scribe. Master Barnaby will be looking for me." The Abbey. The Abbey is a 400-mile march through territory crawling with Lord Gideon's rogues, Dryston interrupted softly, moving to a heavy silver basin in the corner of the room. He poured steaming water from a pitcher and grabbed a clean linen cloth. Gideon's forces wiped out the entire Hastings lineage near the Winchester Ridge just 3 days ago. If they caught the scent of an unbound Omega wandering the roads, death would be a mercy compared to what they would do to you. He walked back to the bed, holding the warm, damp cloth. He paused, waiting for her permission. When Amelie didn't pull away, he gently wiped a smudge of ancient library soot from her pale cheek. The contrast of his massive, scarred, battle-hardened hand against her soft skin was jarring. "You are my mate," Dryston stated, the golden hue in his eyes flaring briefly. It wasn't a question. It was an undeniable, biological fact that tethered their souls together. "And you hold the only weapon that can stop a slaughter. The fates did not send you here by accident." Amelie looked down at the iron-bound grimoire. The crescent moon crest was still pulsing warmly against her palms. Silas said it was the Codex of Ethelgard. I don't know how to read it. When I touched it in the library, it just exploded. Dryston sat on the edge of the mattress, the heavy wood groaning under his weight. Ethelgard was a blood witch of the old world, born during the reign of the Plantagenet kings, before the First Unification. Legend says he mapped the shadow paths, veins of dark magic that run beneath the earth, bypassing physical space. It's how Gideon is moving his army undetected. Amelie cautiously unlatched the heavy iron clasp. The book fell open to a blank page of thick vellum. She frowned, turning the page. Another blank sheet. She flipped through the entire tome. "It's empty," she breathed, a wave of cold dread washing over her. The magic. Maybe the portal burned it out? Dryston leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. He reached out, stopping just an inch from the paper, remembering the violent magical feedback that had blasted Beta Silas across the war room. "It is blood magic, Amelie," Dryston murmured, his gaze shifting from the book to her face. "It doesn't require ink. It requires a tribute." Amelie stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the jagged edge of the iron clasp. Slowly, she reached her hand out. Dryston's hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist like a vice. "No." "But you need the maps," Amelie argued, confused by his sudden interference. "Your general said Gideon is marching. Your men are dying." "I will not bleed my mate for a war," Dryston snarled, the alpha beast rising instantly to the surface, fiercely protective. "I have spent 5 years fighting this war with steel and claw. I will not have you mutilate yourself to fix my tactical failures." Before Amelie could respond, a sharp knock echoed at the heavy chamber doors. Dryston's head snapped toward the sound, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. "Enter," he commanded. The door creaked open, and an older woman stepped in, her eyes immediately dropping to the floor in a deep bow. She wore the grey and silver livery of the Iron Mane royal staff. She carried a silver tray laden with roasted venison, fresh bread, and a goblet of dark wine. "My king," she said, her voice steady but laced with underlying fear. "General Harold sent me. I am Beatrice. I brought sustenance for your guest." "Leave it on the table, Beatrice," Dryston ordered, his eyes tracking her every movement. Beatrice moved quickly, setting the tray down. As she turned to leave, her eyes flicked upward for just a fraction of a second, landing on Amelie, and more specifically, on the iron-bound book resting in her lap. It was a fleeting glance, but Amelie saw the sharp, calculating glint in the servant's eye. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Once the heavy door clicked shut, Dryston turned back to Amelie. "Eat. You are too thin, and the portal drained your energy." Amelie didn't move toward the food. She looked at the blank vellum pages, then at the heavy iron clasp. Dryston had sworn to protect her, but she was a historian, a scribe of Oakhaven. She knew the brutal math of war. A few drops of her blood against the lives of thousands of Iron Mane wolves. "Turn around," Amelie whispered. Drystan frowned. "Amelie. Please, Drystan." It was the first time she had used his name without his title. The sound of it on her lips hit him like a physical blow. His breath hitched, and against his better judgment, the Alpha King obeyed his Omega, turning his broad back to her. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Amelie pressed her thumb firmly against the jagged, rusted iron of the book's latch, the metal bit deep into her flesh. She winced, stifling a gasp as a bead of bright crimson welled up on her skin. She pressed her bleeding thumb directly onto the center of the blank vellum page. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The moment her blood soaked into the parchment, the Codex of Ethelgard slammed shut on its own, nearly trapping her fingers. The iron bindings glowed white-hot, but they didn't burn Amelie. Instead, a beam of pure, agonizingly bright violet light shot directly upward from the cover, hitting the stone ceiling of the bedchamber and fracturing outward like a spiderweb. Dryston spun around, his broadsword clearing its scabbard in a blur of motion. "Amelie!" he roared, lunging forward. "I'm okay!" she cried out, shielded her eyes. "Look!" The light didn't fade. It materialized. Above the bed, hovering in the air, a massive, three-dimensional projection of the Northern Territories painted itself in shimmering violet and gold light. It was a map, far more detailed than anything in Dryston's war room. Every mountain range, every river, every fortress was rendered perfectly. But it wasn't just the surface. Beneath the golden topography, a network of pulsing, dark purple veins writhed like living snakes. "The shadow paths," Drystan breathed, lowering his sword, mesmerized by the sheer scale of the magic. "Gods above. There are hundreds of them." Amelie looked at the map, her archivist's mind immediately snapping to attention, categorizing the geographical markers. "This is Ironhold," she said, pointing to a glowing citadel at the center of the projection. Dryston stepped closer, his eyes scanning the map. "And this is the Winchester Ridge. General Harold was right to want to fortify it. But look." He pointed the tip of his broadsword toward a massive, pulsing purple vein that completely bypassed the ridge, diving deep under the mountains. Inside the purple vein, a cluster of crimson dots was moving rapidly. "Gideon!" Dryston snarled, a visceral hatred lacing his tone. "He isn't marching around the mountains. He's marching under them. He's going to emerge right at the base of the Weeping Valley, 50 miles behind our front lines." "If he emerges there," Amelie said, her heart sinking as she read the terrain, "he has a direct path to the civilian settlements in the lowlands. The packs there, they are mostly elders and pups." "He means to slaughter them to force my surrender," Drystan growled. He turned to the door. "I have to summon the council. We need to intercept him at the valley mouth before he breaks the surface." "Wait!" Amelie shouted, her eyes fixed on the map. The crimson dots representing Gideon's army were alarming, but something else had caught her eye. Much closer. Right inside the golden walls of Ironhold, a single dark purple dot was pulsing rhythmically, nestled deep within the lower levels of the fortress, and a faint, thread-like shadow path was slowly drawing itself from the dot, stretching toward the outer wards. "What is that?" Amelie asked, pointing a trembling finger. Drystan's golden eyes widened. "That's the armory, and the central rune stone that powers the magical wards of the fortress." He stared at the dark dot. "Someone is dismantling the wards from the inside, opening a back door." "A spy," Amelie whispered. Her mind flashed to the calculating look the servant woman had given the book. "Beatrice." Before Drystan could move, the heavy oak doors of the chamber didn't just open, They exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and twisted iron hinges. The concussive blast threw Drystan backward. Amelie screamed, diving off the bed and scrambling beneath the heavy wooden frame, clutching the codex to her chest. Through the dust and smoke, 3 figures stepped into the royal chambers. They weren't Iron Mane guards. They wore black leather armor, stained with dried blood, their eyes glowing a sickly, unnatural red, the mark of rogues who had consumed human blood to enhance their strength. Leading them was a tall, gaunt man with a jagged scar across his throat. Lord Sterling, a banished alpha from the Southern Isles, known for his cruelty. "Well, well," Sterling hissed, his voice a raspy death rattle. The rumors were true. The great King Drystan, playing house with a sweet-smelling little Omega while his kingdom burns. Drystan rose from the rubble. He didn't draw his sword. Instead, his bones cracked violently as his body began to shift. The human skin tore away, replaced in a split second by a massive, terrifying wall of black fur and muscle. The Alpha King's wolf was a monstrous, primal beast, standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, with fangs the size of daggers. The wolf didn't howl. It just launched itself forward with devastating speed. It hit the first rogue like a battering ram, crushing the man's ribcage instantly beneath its massive paws. Blood sprayed across the velvet tapestries. The second rogue swung a silver-laced axe, but Drystan's jaws clamped down on the man's arm, severing it at the elbow with a sickening crunch. Amelie clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face as the brutal sounds of tearing flesh and dying screams echoed through the chamber. The violence was pure, unadulterated, and terrifying. Lord Sterling, realizing he had vastly underestimated the king's feral strength, didn't stay to fight. He lunged toward the bed, his red eyes locking onto Amelie, hiding beneath it. "If I can't kill the king, I'll take his new pet to Gideon," Sterling roared, reaching under the bed with a clawed hand to drag her out by her ankle. Amelie screamed, kicking wildly, but his grip was like iron. He hauled her out onto the blood-slicked stone floor. Before Sterling could lift his blade, a shadow descended upon him. Drystan, covered in the blood of the other 2 rogues, ripped Sterling off Amelie, slamming the rogue Alpha against the stone wall so hard the mortar cracked. Drystan shifted back to his human form mid-air, pinning Sterling by the throat. "How did you get in?" Drystan roared, his voice shaking the floorboards. Sterling spat blood, laughing darkly. "Your walls are already falling, Drystan. The shadow path is open. Gideon's vanguard isn't 50 miles away. They are beneath your fortress right now." Drystan's eyes snapped to the magical projection still hovering over the ruined bed. The single dark dot in the armory had erupted. A massive wave of crimson dots was pouring out from the subterranean levels, flooding directly into the heart of Ironhold. The fortress was under siege from the inside out. The slaughter had already begun. Drystan didn't hesitate. With a sickening crunch that echoed over the roaring chaos outside the heavy oak doors, he snapped Lord Sterling's neck. The rogue Alpha's lifeless body slumped to the floor, joining the bloody ruin of his vanguard. The king didn't spare the corpse a second glance. He whirled around, his broad chest heaving, his hands coated in crimson. The air in the royal chambers, once thick with the scent of pine and Amelie's sweet rain, was now choking with the metallic copper of death and the sulphurous stench of dark magic. "Drystan," Amelie gasped, crawling out from the wreckage of the bed frame. She gripped the Codex of Aethelgard so tightly her knuckles were translucent. The magical projection above them was morphing rapidly. The single dark dot in the armory had expanded into a gaping, bleeding wound on the map, spewing hundreds of red markers upward through the spiraling stone staircases of Ironhold. "They are already on the 2nd tier, Drystan growled, his golden eyes tracking the magical projection. He wiped his bloody hands on his leather breeches and closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He hauled Amelie to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the feral energy radiating from him. We cannot stay here. If they trap us in the royal wing, the fortress falls. Where do we go? Amelie asked, her voice shaking but her mind racing. The archivist in her was categorizing the threat, analyzing the moving pieces on the board. The main gates are completely overrun. To the armory, Dryston said, grabbing his broadsword from the floor. We have to sever the shadow path at its root. If we don't close that portal, Gideon will empty his entire army into my halls. He threw a heavy, fur-lined cloak over Amelie's shoulders, hiding the glowing grimoire beneath the thick pelt. Stay behind me. Do not let go of my belt. If I tell you to run, you run to the upper parapets and throw yourself upon the mercy of the wind before you let them take you. Do you understand me, Amelie? She looked up into his fierce, glowing eyes. He was a terrifying warlord, covered in gore, yet she felt an anchor of absolute safety in his presence. She nodded once. I understand. They burst through the shattered doorway into the royal corridor. It was a scene from a nightmare. The polished stone floors were slick with blood. Ironmane guards were locked in brutal, desperate hand-to-hand combat with Gideon's rogues. The air was a cacophony of clashing steel, feral snarls, and the agonizing screams of dying wolves. Dryston moved like a god of war. He didn't bother shifting. His human form was lethal enough in the narrow confines of the hallway. He carved a path through the vanguard, his broad sword severing limbs and shattering armor with terrifying precision. Amelie stayed pressed to his back, her hand gripping the thick leather of his belt, squeezing her eyes shut every time hot blood sprayed across her face. As they reached the grand staircase leading to the lower levels, a figure launched out of the shadows, twin daggers flashing. Dryston raised his sword, but the figure dropped to a slide, burying a blade into the throat of a rogue creeping up behind them. It was Beta Silas. His face was pale, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, soaked in blood. "My king!" Silas gasped, kicking the dead rogue down the stairs. "The lower bailey is gone. General Harold is holding the Great Hall, but they are flooding in from the armory. It's a massacre. They have magic, witches, hiding among the ranks." "I know," Dryston roared over the din of battle. "The servant, Beatrice, she poisoned the wards from the inside." "Beatrice!" Silas's eyes widened in shock. "But she has served the House of Ironmane for 20 years. She is the widow of Lord Alistair of the Moray clan." "A long con," Amelie spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady. She pulled the codex out slightly, letting the violet light illuminate the dark stairwell. "Look at the map, Silas. The magic anchoring the portal isn't rogue magic, it's blood magic. Specifically, the Hemlock Coven of the Western Isles. I recognize the rune structures from the St. Jude archives. Beatrice isn't just a servant. She's a high priestess." Silas stared at the tiny Omega, stunned by her sudden authority and tactical knowledge. Dryston merely smirked, a flash of immense pride piercing through his battle rage. "Can you close it, little bird?" Dryston asked, looking down at her. I don't know," Amelie admitted, staring at the swirling violet ink. "The book opened the map with my blood. To close the physical path, I would need to overwrite the witch's tether. I would need to touch the central rune stone." "Then we get you to the stone," Dryston commanded. "Silas, rally whatever men you can find on this floor. Form a wedge. We are pushing down to the armory." The descent into the bowels of Ironhold was a descent into hell. The heat from the underground forges had mixed with the suffocating stench of ozone from the open shadow path. They fought inch by bloody inch. Dryston took a glancing blow to his shoulder from a warhammer, but he didn't even flinch, using his massive weight to crush the attacker against the stone wall. Amelie kept her eyes fixed on the codex, using the live projection to warn them of ambushes waiting behind blind corners. 3 rogues behind the tapestry on the left, she screamed over the noise. Silas threw a dagger blindly through the heavy fabric, rewarded by a wet thud and a gargling scream. Finally, they reached the heavy iron vault doors of the armory. The doors had been blown off their hinges, warped and melted by intense magical heat. From inside, a blinding, pulsing vortex of dark purple energy illuminated the cavernous room. Dryston stepped through the ruined doorway, Amelie right behind him. The center of the room was dominated by the Mother Stone, a massive, glowing quartz monolith that powered Ironhold's defenses. Standing before it, her hands pressed against the crystal, was Beatrice. Her grey servant's livery was gone, replaced by flowing, blood-red robes. Her eyes were completely black, and she was chanting in a guttural ancient tongue. But it wasn't the witch that made Dryston stop dead in his tracks. Stepping out of the violet vortex, flanked by a dozen massive, heavily armoured Lycan elites, was Lord Gideon. He was a hulking brute of a man, clad in armour, made from the blackened bones of his conquered enemies. His face was a map of horrifying scars, and his eyes burned with a sickening, corrupted crimson light. He carried a battle-axe that dripped with a dark, necrotic poison. "Drystan," Gideon sneered, his voice echoing like grinding stones. "You are late to your own funeral." "You broke the ancient laws, Gideon," Drystan growled, his alpha aura exploding outward. The air pressure in the armory plummeted so fast that the glass vials on the alchemy tables shattered. "You brought blood witches into Lycan warfare. You forfeit your honor." Gideon threw his head back and laughed, a hollow, terrifying sound. "Honor is a luxury for men who sit on thrones they didn't earn. The Ironmane lineage ends tonight. Lady Arabella," he said, gesturing to the witch formerly known as Beatrice, "shatter the stone. Let the rest of my army through." The witch intensified her chanting. The Mother Stone began to spiderweb with black, venomous cracks. "Stop her!" Dryston roared. He charged, a blur of lethal momentum. Gideon's elites stepped forward to intercept, but Dryston tore through them. He caught a heavy sword blow on his vambrace, spun, and decapitated the attacker in a single fluid motion. Silas flanked him, his remaining good armor whirlwind of deadly steel, but Gideon didn't wait. He stepped into the fray, swinging his massive bone axe in a devastating arc. Dryston barely parried it. The impact of the 2 Alpha Kings clashing sent a shockwave through the room, throwing Amelie to the floor. "You die tonight, Dryston!" Gideon roared, unleashing a flurry of blows that forced Dryston backward. The corrupt magic in Gideon's veins gave him unnatural speed and strength. Dryston was fighting a monster fueled by dark sorcery. Amelie scrambled behind a fallen weapon rack, clutching the codex. The room was a maelstrom of violence. Silas was engaged with 3 elites, bleeding heavily. Drystan was locked in a death struggle with Gideon, their blades sparking as they pushed against each other, veins bulging in their necks. And at the center of it all, Lady Arabella was pouring her dark magic into the Mother Stone. The vortex behind her was widening. Amelie could hear the marching boots of 1,000 more rogues, echoing from the shadow path. If they crossed the threshold, the north would fall. To close the path, you must overwrite the tether. The words echoed in Amelie's mind. She looked down at the codex. The blood she had shed in the bedroom was still fresh on the vellum. She looked at the Mother Stone, 30 feet away. She was an Omega, a scribe. She had never held a sword. She had spent her life hiding from the world. But as she watched Dryston take a brutal knee to the ribs from Gideon, a fierce, protective fire ignited in her chest. The dormant wolf inside her, suppressed for 22 years, finally bared its teeth. Amelie didn't think. She acted. She threw off the heavy fur cloak. Clad only in her ruined, blood-stained woolen robes, she bolted from behind the weapon rack, running directly into the crossfire. "Amelie, no!" Drystan roared, seeing her move out of the corner of his eye. His distraction cost him. Gideon's axe grazed his cheek, opening a deep, bleeding gash. Amelie ignored the clash of steel, ignored the hulking rogues tearing at Silas. She sprinted directly toward Lady Arabella. The Blood Witch turned, her black eyes widening in surprise as the tiny, fragile human rushed her. Arabella raised a hand, gathering a sphere of dark, concussive energy to blast Amelie into the walls. But Arabella had underestimated her. She didn't sense a warrior, she sensed an Omega. And in the magical realm, an unbound Omega possessed an aura of pure, uncorrupted life energy, the absolute antithesis of necrotic blood magic. Amelie didn't slow down. She raised the heavy iron codex of Ethelgard like a battering ram and slammed it directly into Arabella's chest. The impact of the ancient grimoire meeting the dark witch was explosive. A shockwave of blinding white light erupted from the collision. Arabella shrieked, her dark magic short-circuiting as the pure energy of the codex ripped through her. The witch was thrown backward, crashing into the stone wall and sliding to the floor, unconscious. Amelie fell to her knees before the cracked mother stone. The vortex of the shadow path was raging just feet away, the vanguard of the rogue army visible through the tear in reality. She opened the codex. Her previous blood stain was glowing. She pressed her bleeding thumb directly onto the jagged iron clasp again, tearing the wound wider, and slammed her bloody palm flat against the surface of the mother stone. "By the ancient laws of Ethelgard, I sever this tether!" Amelie screamed, echoing a banishment text she had transcribed 100 times in the dusty archives of Oakhaven. The magic recognized her blood. It recognized her absolute intent. The codex pulsed with a deafening hum. The violet light of the shadow path suddenly froze. The dark veins in the projection snapped. With a sound like a collapsing mountain, the shadow path imploded. The vortex violently contracted, severing the connection to the subterranean tunnels. The rogues who were halfway through the portal were sheared in half as reality snapped back into place. The room plunged into sudden, eerie silence, save for the heavy breathing of the surviving warriors. Gideon stared at the empty space where his army had been, his red eyes wide with absolute disbelief. His victory had been snatched away by a frail, trembling girl. "You," Gideon snarled, raising his axe, turning his murderous rage entirely onto Amelie. He never took a step. Dryston, fueled by the primal terror of seeing his mate threatened, shifted completely. The massive, black-furred alpha beast launched through the air, completely ignoring the poisoned axe. Dryston's jaws clamped directly onto Gideon's throat. The momentum carried them both to the floor. There was a sickening snap of bone, a wet tear of flesh, and Lord Gideon's reign of terror ended in a pool of black blood on the armory floor. Dryston shifted back instantly, his chest heaving, his face covered in gore. He didn't look at his fallen enemy. He crawled across the stone floor and pulled Amelie into his chest, burying his face in her dark curls. "I have you," Dryston choked out, his voice thick with emotion, his massive arms wrapping around her like a fortress. "I have you, little bird. It's over." Amelie dropped the heavy iron book, her trembling arms wrapping around the king's thick neck. The adrenaline faded, leaving only exhaustion, and the overwhelming, safe scent of pine and wood smoke. Surrounded by the ruins of a war she had just ended, the quiet scribe from Oakhaven finally let herself cry. The winter snows that buried the northern territories that year brought an unprecedented era of peace. With Lord Gideon dead and the shadow paths sealed forever, the rogue armies fractured and surrendered. Ironhold, once a grim fortress of endless war, slowly transformed. The brutalist stone corridors were softened by light, and a massive new wing was constructed. Not an armory, but the grandest library the continent had ever seen. Amelie never returned to the dusty shadows of Oakhaven Abbey. The shy, hidden scribe blossomed under the fiercely protective and adoring gaze of the Alpha King, embracing her true nature. She was crowned Queen of the Ironmane Pack, a revered Omega whose courage had saved thousands of lives. She no longer masked her scent with bitter wolfsbane. The halls of Ironhold now carried the permanent, comforting fragrance of wild honey and rain. Beside her, King Dryston ruled with a newfound temperance, his feral edges smoothed by the mate who had fallen from the sky and rewritten the history of the realm.